Hey everybody, we'll get started once a few more people get here. Mm. Okay, I think I'm gonna go ahead and get started, and as people join us, they can just hop right in. And if there's any questions, we will save time at the end for me to address those. Okay, so let me go ahead and screen share. Okay, can everybody see that? Okay. Here we go. So, my name is Caitlin Grimes. I am the Global Communications Director for Students for Liberty. And today we're going to be talking about communicating to Liberty for a mass audience, specifically for our student activists in Africa. So, we're going to go over a few foundational terms and theories, and then we're going to get into the nitty gritty of, how to be an effective writer, how to pitch your stories, how to broadcast them once you have them. And then I'm going to leave at least 10 to 15 minutes at the end for anyone to ask questions. You can put them in the comment box. If that's not working, feel free to post them in the Facebook group. I see those as well. But please make sure that you write down your questions and you save them to the end because I'm just going to push all the way through. The first thing that we're going to talk about is finding your niche. And what I mean by this is niche is a term derived from science, actually, referring to an organism's ideal place in an ecosystem. As with the environment, you should find your niche when it comes to writing or your specialty. It's great to be an effective writer in general. A really good writer can write for anything, but a really effective writer has a level of expertise in one or two subjects to which people will always come to him or her for. For instance, are these are writers who specialize in tech, in certain areas of policy, like economics or foreign policy. Um, Effective writers, as I said, not only write effectively in any situation, but develop a specialized niche for themselves. So the question is how do you find your niche? So the best way to find your kind of place in the writing ecosystem is to develop your own personal story or brand that kind of follows you wherever you go. And this is where a certain kind of level of self-evaluation is needed. Kind of like dig in and kind of come to some conclusions about yourself. What is your personal story? How did you come to find liberty? Why do you care so much about the ideas of liberty? Was it because of an experience that you had in your younger years or an experience that you had on a college campus? Or was it a realization you had while watching videos on YouTube? All of our stories are different. And these stories usually tend to tell us a little bit about the areas that we care most about. For me personally, for example, like I found liberty on my college campus primarily through fighting the free speech codes that were there. So, one of my prevalent issues that I usually always write about is the freedom of expression, specifically the First Amendment in the United States. And I tend to be an expert on that. I know everything about speech codes. I know everything about the constitutional regards, the court cases, and that's kind of what I mean by finding your niche. So the reason I bring up, selling your personal story is because traditionally in public address or public communication, Aristotle has been used, and Aristotle believed that human beings were rational, which means that they weighed the costs and benefits of every decision that they made and always make decisions that benefit them the most. In the 1970s, another academic kind of came onto the playing field named Walter Fisher, who said that human beings are not rational, whereas they are instead narrative animals. They are storytelling animals. They care more about good stories, good reasoning, and sometimes logic is thrown in there, but mostly they care about the emotional ties to a story. So the moral of this is audiences generally care more about a story than a policy line. They will, if you're talking about, for instance, Uber or Lyft, they're going to care more about how Uber or Lyft kind of helped a new immigrant to the United States kind of make it or allowed for someone to safely make it home, whereas they didn't have or taxis traditionally. Excuse me. Those kinds of stories are always going to go better with the public instead of saying a policy line like that Lyft and Uber is going to affect X, Y, and Z economically. That just doesn't sell with the general public. Now, there are exceptions to this rule. If you are writing for academia or for an academic journal, it's always much better to go with a policy line or academic research than a story. Stories don't really hold a lot of ground there, but we'll get more into that when we talk about mediums towards the end of the presentation. The main purpose of this slide is for all of you to kind of realize that you need to go through some self-evaluation, figure out what your personal story or brand is, how you can add your own spin onto whatever story you're writing or blog you're writing using that personal story and brand and kind of start carving out a niche for yourself in the writing scene. The next thing we're going to talk about is credibility. This has become a big and prevalent issue in the United States recently with the talks about fake news. Um, so what is credibility? And it's not always going to be whether you have a college degree or certification or an award. Credibility is where you've built yourself a positive reputation for being trustworthy when it comes to the media. You're always at least being truthful and moral and ethical with your sources and how you portray something. So there are two perspectives on credibility. There's the philosophical perspective and the technical perspective that like speechwriters and writers use. So the philosophical perspective says that credibility has three parts: ethos, pathos, and logos. Ethos is kind of the perception of how ethical you are. Logos is your logic, and pathos is kind of your character. Or do you seem like a trustworthy person? Moving on to the technical side of credibility, initial credibility, and this is going to be the biggest hurdle for a few of you, is the credibility that you have when you come into a situation. So if you've never written or had a published story before, you don't have a kind of existing credibility to kind of build off on. You've got to kind of make your way into the market. And that's why it's especially important in the first few pieces that you ever publish to make sure that you outline your own credibility, either as a writer or on the subject to which you're speaking. Terminal credibility is the credibility that you have as it builds up over time. The more credibility you have, to be honest, the more likely your stuff is going to be accepted favorably by the public. The more likely you are to be asked to write more, to get published more. Derived credibility is the credibility that you earn from a specific speech or a written piece. Say you get a piece published today on the Syrian conflict and it was perceived as extremely credible. The derived credibility would be the credibility that you earned from that one piece. So these all add up to kind of to establish your professional credibility as a writer. And you need to kind of make sure that you're considering these when you write and how you present yourself. Um, because as I say at the bottom of these slides, you've got to be careful not to lose credibility because it is very, very hard to earn back. We're seeing this in the United States right now, where Twitter is kind of damaging a lot of journalists to the point that their pieces aren't being published anymore. So your credibility is almost your money line because if you damage your credibility, it's very hard to continually get published. And if that's your only source of income, you might be in trouble. So how do you lose credibility? You can lose credibility by not properly finding and sourcing your sources, not being upfront about your own personal bias in certain subjects. Like if you're from a town that you're writing about, make sure that you put in there that you've been like a resident of that town for X, Y, and Z. And also not bringing in multiple perspectives. So if you always write with a oblivious and obvious slant, like what's going on in the United States right now, people who like to read that stuff will read you, but pretty much everyone else will stop. So you've lost your credibility with 2/3 of your public there. So the next thing we're going to talk about is developing your message. And this is something that good journalists and good writers always spend a lot of time on. So what is a message? The message is the one line or two from your writing that you want the audience to remember long after they have finished reading. This is usually maybe the last few sentences. Sometimes it's at the top. Sometimes you repeat it. But this is kind of the short summary or synopsis that when someone goes to their friend at the bar later, they're like, oh, I read this awesome article and it said X, Y, and Z. And I definitely believe that. So it's basically what you want people to take away from whatever you're reading. Best practices for developing your message is you need to keep it simple and short. Again, you want this to be something that they will easily remember, so no complex words. This usually means it's less than 2 sentences. We'll get into how that differs by medium later, but the general rule of thumb is keep it less than 2 sentences. Include a solution and empathy if possible. So it's always easy to outline a problem that's existing currently in either society or government, but it's not always as easy to pose a solution. And that doesn't mean you have to have a very fleshed out solution. Sometimes the solution is we should all talk more about this. But make sure that you are including at least some response that your readers can either imagine or partake in. And it's always a good idea to have an empathetic angle on it if possible. So, for instance, with capitalism, our biggest opponents always say that capitalism doesn't help people who are impoverished, people who are trying to pull themselves up by their bootstraps. We know that isn't true. We know that capitalism is truly one of the most moral economic systems ever kind of developed in society. So you need to kind of showcase that whatever solution you're offering or your take on the solution or problem has some empathetic note. How is it going to help people? How is it going to help a community? How is it going to help this one person live a better life? Always include that if at all possible. So an example of a message, and this is not from a article per se, but this is SFL's mission, which, if you don't know it, is at the bottom. SFL's mission is to educate, develop, and empower students to create a freer future. So this is what we use on a lot of our materials, but technically this is a message. We're posing a solution, and we've created an empathetic kind of spin on it. The word empower is an empathetic power word, so it carries a lot of emotion with it when you read the word empower. But this is definitely like something we want people to remember when they think of SFL. We want this to come to people's minds. So this is a excellent example of a message. Okay, to further learn how to develop your message, it's three parts. So find the root of your problem, find your solution, and then present them both through an empathetic or narrative frame. So for instance, let's use the drug war, since we're about to do a bunch of stuff with that this week. So the issue, at least in the United States, is that our current government and current legislation disproportionately affects minorities when it comes to drug arrests. It's made our prisons the most overpopulated in the world. And then, of course, you got our moral side that says that the government really shouldn't be telling people what to do with their bodies. So that's our problem. This legislation is causing all of these side effects. So what our solution is to end the drug war, and that there's many multifaceted things that we're wanting to push. But the main thing is to end the government's war on drugs. So if I wanted to present this through a empathetic or narrative frame, I would find a example of a individual, probably someone who has been in prison due to mandatory minimums for over 10 years simply for having weed on them or smoking weed, but they're nonviolent. And I would use their story to present the solution of ending the drug war so that these people could reenter society, pay taxes, have families, and really kind of be a pro to society instead of a burden. That's kind of how I would start to develop that message. And I will say that this is something you don't do very quickly. In fact, what I usually do when I'm writing a piece, I'm writing a piece right now for cannabis legalization for this Friday. I usually write my piece first, and then once I've finished editing my piece, I go back through and then I write my message. I rewrite it at least 5, 6, 7 times. I have someone else read it. And then I insert it usually at the bottom is where I insert it. It's usually in the last paragraph where I insert my message. Um, but that's kind of the process that I take to develop it. Always rewrite it. The first draft of this is never usually the one you go with. Make sure that you have someone else read over it. If you need someone on the SFL staff to read over it, we're here for you. I know Matt Boyer reads through my stuff most of the time, and he's our media guy. So, in general, presenting the ideas of liberty. So, these are just some good practices to have in all forms of writing if you're trying to communicate the ideas of liberty. May it be something on the journalistic side, social media, marketing side, internal, external communications, public speaking. These are all good rules of thumb to follow. Excuse me. As I've already said, make sure to tell a story. Um, Two things to remember when you're telling a story is coherence and fidelity. So coherence means that your story makes sense logically by what we know in society. So for instance, you couldn't say Bob went and Bob had no money. Bob was from the slums, never got a college degree, but all of a sudden now he's like a two worth 200 million or something like that and runs his own business. So that's great, but you didn't tell us how Bob made it to that point. So make sure that you are telling all the key points in the story for it to be effective. Fidelity means that it just has a sense of truth and honor to it. So we're not going to say someone is like an alien because we're just not going to accept that as true. So you've got to make sure that it rings true for what we know to be true in society. So the second thing, kind of tying into that, is make sure that you sell the story. The money is in the details. That is what people love to read. They want to read about the struggle. They want to read about how they overcame the struggle, the little quirks about the person, about the story that make it unique. Like what kind of business did Bob have? How did he like get that initial loan? How did he overcome poverty? The money is in the details, and the more details that you have in a story or a written piece, the more likely it is to get picked up. Third, don't use ivory tower language. And I don't know if you guys know what the ivory tower is. It's kind of a metaphor used in academia. Kind of suggests that academics, they live up in this great ivory tower reading all about society, but they don't actually live in it. They just look down and use big language and big terms that no one else understands to describe the behavior they see. So libertarians in general have a problem with this. We use terms like the non-aggression principle or laissez-faire economics. And to us, like these words make sense because like we take our time reading them and understanding these ideas, but in general, the public does not. I would actually suggest staying away from words like capitalism and communism because there's so much emotion already devoted to those words. I would instead use free market and centrally planned economy for communism. If you're wanting to use those ideas in a written piece, you're likely to have more reception to them if you do that. But the main thing to take away from this is don't use language in your written pieces that no one else is going to understand. You need to make sure that you're writing for the lowest common denominator, the lowest reading level that you think is going to read your stuff. So a good rule of thumb is for us in the United States, I was always told to write for someone in the 8th grade. So in general, if you think someone who's younger than or who's 15 or 16 years old will understand the word you're using, then it's probably best to either explain it long form or define another word. So, as I've also said before, make sure to use an empathetic frame. Another big issue that libertarians and pro liberty individuals have is that we kind of come across as cold, we come across as unempathetic, and people think that we just generally don't care about everyone in society. As I said before, this is simply not true. But we need to make sure that we're writing in such a way that we showcase the ideas of liberty as being empathetic to the plight of the minority, to the plight of those who live in poverty. And it will take some time to learn how to do that effectively, but if you can master it, you will be an amazing writer. And at the same time, you will be amazing at presenting these ideas to new audiences. So the final thing is showcase liberty or the ideas of liberty and the free market as the moral high ground. Again, people think that capitalism is this evil beast that destroys people's lives. We know that that isn't the case. We know that it's cronyism and big government and all these other things that are really causing it, and that capitalism catches the blame. So when you're choosing your story and when you're choosing your frame and what language you use, always kind of have this mindset that you're trying to showcase liberty and the free market as the moral high ground. It will help more people. It will hurt less people than any other idea. So just keep that in mind as you're writing. The next important thing that you need to do is analyze your audience. So the biggest mistake you can make is writing something without analyzing your audience. An example for this is if you're in school and you're writing a paper for a professor, you know who your audience is going to be. You know it's going to be that professor. You probably know what kind of things they like to see in papers, what kind of topics they want to avoid. If your professor is political, you usually know how to frame your ideas so that they will at least, throw it in the trash. So you need to analyze both your medium and your audience. Why? To ensure that you curtail both the message and the writing to them. So the message you develop for like a blog or a media is going to be different than something that you develop for an internal audience or academia. Again, that's the one that's always out in the right field. That's different. And then the medium is going to kind of determine how long your message can be, what kind of language you can be included in your message. So important things about the audience to consider. The first is education. So if you're writing for, let's say, um, a national news outlet, and I'm going to use the United States here because I don't know a lot about the media in Africa. So in general, in the United States, if you read a national outlet, you at least have a bachelor's degree. Um, so that's something to consider. People have usually gone to college. They have a pretty good literacy level. The next is income. So people who subscribe to national news usually have spare income, whereas other places do not. The culture. So how if you're writing in the southern United States, you're gonna be writing a little bit differently than if you're from the northern United States. For instance, I live in the Bible Belt, is a term that we use here. It's the southern, southeastern United States that is really religious. So a lot of the writing that this audience is receptive to either has to address religion or tie back to religion. And if you're anti-religious in your writing, then they will either not read you or purposely make your lives awful on social media, one of the two. So you've got to consider culture when you're writing. Like if you're writing for all of Africa, then bring in Africa's culture to it. Like tie it back into something that only people who have lived in Africa will understand. That's curtailing your message. Geography. So the best example for this is if you're writing about the weather, then you're going to be making sure that you're writing what the weather is going to be in that area, not another, because that's what that audience is going to care about. So make sure that you kind of at least think about these four things when you're deciding how to write, where to write, what to write, what words to use, what frame to kind of use as well. All four of these things play an important part in if your audience is going to, one, read what you wrote, and that's the first battle, and then two, actually absorb what you wrote. So because that's what we want. We not only want people to read what you're writing, we want them to absorb, to think about it, and to hopefully take action from what you write. So we need to make sure that we're curtailing both the message and the medium to them. Okay, so fitting the message to the medium. Different mediums have different audiences and different writing styles. So when you're writing a piece, you need to decide what medium you want to place it in. So there's a few mediums that we use. The first, of course, is our blog. All of the regions within SFL have their own blogs, which are run by individual blog managers and volunteer bloggers within the student programs. Um, we and then kind of the national side of things, we don't usually touch this. We train you guys and kind of allow you guys to run these yourselves. If you need us to look over things or to change kind of the technical side of the blog, that's what we're here for. But the easiest medium to get you guys published in would be the blog that we already own. But of course, we also have partnerships with tons of partner organizations who have their own blogs, who would love to get some stuff from you guys. Like I know the Foundation for Economic Education is one. So that's one medium. Mass media is the next, which is kind of when you think of a journalist, this is kind of what comes to mind. But this is kind of two-pronged now because you have traditional journalists who kind of write about the news, what's going on, so on and so forth. And then we also have opinion editorial pieces, which is a lot of what we do now at SFL, where we write op-eds, and I'll get into those in a minute. There's academia, so journals, maybe policy, think tanks kind of stuff. SFL, we don't really have a lot to do with this, but if you're interested in academic writing, I can help you, or we can kind of help you get set up with IHS or some other think tank that we have a partnership with. But if you're interested in academic writing, make sure to take down my email at the end of this and reach out to me because academic writing is a completely different beast. That you have to go through like a peer review process, and that's just a whole different beast. But if you're interested in that, let me know. Social media. So copywriting for social media is a big one now. And then general marketing writing. So these are kind of the different mediums that your writing can take place through. I'm going to hit a few of these. Some of these I've left out, like academia, because They're just too big to tackle here. Okay, medium, mass media. Depending on the outlet, the word count can range from either 600 words to 800 to 1,000 words. So if you're writing a general news piece, not an opinion piece, and there is a big difference. Usually articles are under 600 words. If you're writing an opinion editorial piece, they can usually be between 800 and 1,000 words. Something to bear in mind. So news articles, you're just delivering the news. You're not really trying to add your own personal spin or angle to it. Well, if you're an ethical journalist, you're not. And then there's opinion pieces. This is where you tie in ethical journalism with opinion. If you need examples on these, we've got tons of them. I had one published back 2 weeks ago about the omnibus bill here in the United States. The key thing is with mass media, they are very strict on sources and credibility. So when you go to pitch a piece or you go to send in a piece, you need to make sure that all of your sources are in there and that you've looked through all your sources and they're credible. So make sure that you're not kind of taking anything from clickbait sites or fake news sites or sites that haven't been strict about their own credibility. Because as I said before, this can really damage you later on. And if people are going to read your piece, and we hope that they do, sometimes when you say controversial things, they're going to go and check your sources. So you want to make sure that you have sound sources there for them to check on to prove that your opinion is right. So usually with opinion pieces, you need an angle or frame, kind of a position to take on. So, for instance, with my piece that I'm currently working on about cannabis legalization, my angle or frame is kind of that Jeff Sessions, who is our current attorney general, is basically the largest block to legalizing cannabis in the United States, and that he should really kind of change his position, listen to some success stories of people whose lives have been changed through medical cannabis, and remove cannabis from being a Schedule One drug. So that's going to be my message at the very end of the article, but it's also the angle and frame that I wrote the whole piece from. So after you've read my entire article, it's not going to be a surprise that I suggest this at the end. I will have placed sources, like I've got sources from the DEA, from the National Health Institute, all these things have been pulled in. So when you make that claim at the end, it's not a big shocker. You've already kind of led up to it. So that's kind of writing for mass media. So next is online blogs. So blogs are beautiful in the fact that you can pretty much do anything depending on the blog that you're writing for. If you're doing a guest post for either an organization or a paid blogger somewhere else, you usually have to go by whatever rules that they have. In general, I would say keep blog posts to roughly 800 words, but it can really be long or short. Like I said, it just depends on the blog. So the writing format is more informal. It's less strict on credibility, but don't get lazy, because if you're going to be publishing on multiple mediums, people will go back and find blogs that you've written. So make sure that my good rule of thumb is to be as credible with blogs as you are with mass media, because blogs are not off the table when people start doing research on you. They will absolutely use them. So do what you want here, but I would suggest continuing to be as strict as possible with your credibility. You can also have photos, like you can do photo blogging, video blogging, GIFs. I've used GIFs and blogs before. You can be really creative. Just make sure that you source everything that you use that is not yours. So if you use photos from SFL, that's fine. You guys are more than free to use those. But if you're using photos from, like, say, the Atlas Network or something like that, then we need to make sure that we give them credit for whatever content of theirs that we're reproducing. Blogs can also be more easily monetized. However, it's a good note to make here is if you're making money off a blog, like promoting either a product or a service, which is what a lot of people do now to make money, make sure that you put a small note on there that you do make money from either like page views or ad sales. Again, this goes back to your credibility. I always think it's better to be honest about these things. In terms of political blogs, I don't think this will be a problem, but if you ever decide to monetize your own blog, I would just suggest admitting that you're making money off certain paid content. Social media. So if you're writing for social media, this is a skill that takes some time. I won't lie to you guys. It's something that's constantly evolving. So my general rule of thumb is keep it short and sweet. Just because you can have 240 characters on Twitter now doesn't mean that you should. Because in general, the audience that you have on social media, like they're not looking to read really long posts. They want short and sweet. Now, the exception to this is LinkedIn. LinkedIn loves long posts. So if you want to go and have a very extensive post about maybe professionalism in the liberty movement, LinkedIn is the place to post it. Because that's really the only social media platform that encourages long content. Facebook and Twitter do not. So keep it short, keep it sweet. It usually needs a call to action. So what do you want people to kind of do from that content? Do you want them to sign up for an email list? Do you want them to donate? Do you want them to like your page? So it usually needs a call to action. It can be funny, but don't try to be funny if you're not actually funny. And this is going back to a little bit of self-evaluation. Yeah, so I'm like sarcastically funny, but I'm really not when it comes to social media. So I just say this because if you try to be funny and it comes off wrong, everything lives forever on social media. It will never die. Even if you delete it, someone will have screenshot it and it'll come back to haunt you. So make sure you reread everything that you're about to post to social media. Maybe get another person to read it and see if they think it's just as funny as you do. And also ask yourself if content being funny is going to help what you're trying to do or if it's going to hurt. Because I do think that with libertarians, like we love memes, we love GIFs, but it really comes back to bite us sometimes. And we come off being kind of rude and mean sometimes. So just make sure that you're being thoughtful about that discourse. It can be an invitation to discourse. So what we're trying to do with the SFL social media right now is we're trying to use our platform to start discussions. So we ask specific questions about issues going on, like, do you think that the United States should be involved in Syria or something like that? It's always better to ask a question than to make a statement when you're doing that, especially if you're writing social media posts for like a student chapter page or the Africa SFL page. Because anything that comes across on that isn't a question is going to be considered a statement supported by the organization. So if you're ever writing for social media that is not your own, make sure that you remember that whatever you write is going to be perceived as being the position or thoughts of the organization of whose Twitter or Facebook you're using. So just something to keep in mind. So once you have, developed a piece or written a blog, how do you get it out there? So there's a few things that you guys have access to through SFL. So we have the blog, of course. We've already talked about that. We also have Matthew Boyer, who is our media and PR person. He does work predominantly on North America and Consumer Choice Center things, but he does try his best to help the global student community, and I help as well when I have time, getting you pitched to news outlets in the United States. And this can range from anything from like the Washington Post opinion editorial section or on FEE's website. FEE would love content from you guys if that's something you're interested in. So we can help you by reaching out to the contacts that we already have established, getting you pitched, hopefully getting you published. If you are interested in speaking kind of on a news outlet, this is something that we recently did with Savannah Lindquist, who is one of our leaders here. When those opportunities come up, or if we can create an opportunity, we're always here to help. Something to bear in mind is we not only have contacts within the United States, we also now have contacts at Al Jazeera, BBC. And we're working on getting more kind of throughout the region in Europe and Africa and Asia. But as we create those kind of connections, come to us and we would love to use them. Public speaking opportunities. So usually if you're a writer on a certain subject, it'll get to the point where people ask you to come speak. or that SFL will ask you to speak, one of the two. So we can help you with that. The last thing is we have, of course, all of our social media channels. I think we get an average of 3 million unique views on our Facebook page every month. So if you would like for us to blast out your article or your blog on the main SFL page, we would love to do that. Just either email me or let Femi or Miawa know, and they'll send it my way. So if you're not using SFL resources, or if you want to start kind of like branching out, how do you self broadcast? So, of course, you've got your own social media. I would, little side note here, I would not start your own like public figure page until you've maybe got at least like 100,000 views on an article or something. That'll just be confusing. But definitely use your personal social media to push it out. A little thing that I think helps is to develop your own email list. So this is something that I do. So people who I know like to read my stuff will give me their email, or I'll just keep track of people who say they want to get it. And then every time I get published, I will blast it out to this group of people I have on this list, and they will usually in turn blast it out on their own email list. So if you're going to be a writer, I would always suggest like keeping like a Google Doc with all the people who love to, read your content, and it will continue to grow. And eventually, if you have like your own website or your own blog, you can actually set it up to where you can capture people's emails and kind of really start building your email list. But this is kind of what I would suggest for self broadcast. Okay, so that's all I have for you guys today. So, are there any questions? Any questions? Can you guys see or comment in the box? Do, do, do. I don't see any questions in the group. Okay, well, if there's no questions, again, here is my email. I'll put it in the box. So if you ever want either someone, one, to read over your stuff, I'm always willing to be an editor. Two, to get your stuff published. I can connect you guys with Boyer to get you into places here in the States. Or if you ever want to talk about academic writing, that is one of my specialties as well. I have been published in an academic journal. And that's a whole nother process, like I said. So if you're ever interested in that, just shoot me an email. We're here for you. Or if you have any questions that you can't think of right now, please feel free to email me. But that's all I have for you guys, unless you have any questions. Okay, I will see you all when I see you or talk to you soon.